Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Indexer Office Hours. Today is the 19th of April, and this is Indexer Office Hours 57. If you're new to Indexer Office Hours, we love to hear participation, so you can either do that via voice or text. We'll invite you to the stage and you can speak, ask questions, comment on certain things when we give you all the chance. We're excited today because we have a nice agenda as always, a lot of interesting things to talk about. And one thing I always like to mention is, we appreciate each and every one of you for showing up every single week and participating, contributing to the conversation. And so for that, we'd love to reward you with a POAP as a token of our appreciation. So somewhere in the call towards the end, we'll say a secret word, and then you can download the POAP app and claim your POAP. So without further ado, I'd say let's get into the good stuff. As always, we like to open up with a GRTIQ shout out. So today, this week's episode was episode 60 with Dan Enright, if I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. And he's an indexer from 𝗨𝗀𝗧𝗧𝗧. So Nick did a great job interviewing him, talking to him about his whole journey of getting into, blockchain, but also the graph ecosystem, how he set up his indexer. And one thing I liked about this episode is that newer indexers, would need to get some shine as well. And I feel like GRTIQ, in particular this episode, did a great job of shining the light on a newer indexer and kind of showing, the journey of how they entered into the space. And so if you're also a newer indexer and want to hear from a fellow indexer, Dan, about his journey, I recommend you go check out that episode. It is linked in the agenda, so go ahead and listen to that. As always, we'll mention the Graph Day announcement. So Graph Day is happening on June the 2nd, 2022 in San Francisco. There will also be a hackathon from the 3rd of June to the 5th of June, 2022. And so if you want to be a part of this amazing event, make sure to sign up. Tickets are moving fast, so make sure you go ahead and do that. Again, links will be in the agenda. And so there you go. That is everything for opening remarks. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Anna to take us into Repo Watch.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the regular segment of Repo Watch. As always, we've updated the agenda to include links to release notes and PRs. So if you want to follow along, check out the agenda. Before we start with major blockchain clients, I want to remind you that last week we've updated the flow a bit to only mention the clients that have had new releases. All other repos will still be found on the agenda with details on their last release, but in the interest of time and being efficient and effective, they will not be mentioned as part of Repo Watch anymore. So without further ado, on major blockchain clients, on Aragon, we have had a new release, so version 2022-04-02 beta. And this contains a small fix for erroneous assert in MDBX, but it also contains a bigger change, which is a location change for the lib MDBX submodule, which is used to build tools like MDBX stat and MDBX copy. So the location has changed from GitHub to an alternative mirror, and the reason for the change has been following the removal of MDBX from GitHub. So you might need to update based on this change. So keep an eye out on that. Then on Streaming Fast ETH, we have had a new release. So version 0.10.2, and this mainly contains a small fix to an S3 empty file name that was causing problems with downstream dependencies like the merger. So if your experiencing problems with the merger on a streaming fast Ethereum, consider upgrading to this new version. For the rest of the major blockchain clients, we haven't had any new releases. So before we move on to the graph stack, I would like to ask if anyone has had good or bad upgrade experiences that they'd like to report with Aragon or Streaming Fast ETH. I will take that as nobody has tried these releases. I'm assuming it's also because of all of the other events that are happening at this time. So we'll probably have a lighter update. On the graph stack, so for GraphNode, we haven't had new releases. However, we have had 2 pull requests that we have discussed last week merged. So that would be pull request 3440 that contains documentation on how to add a new chain to GraphNode. So that has been merged. And pull request 3446, which reorganizes index for as type ID variants for future blockchain implementation in order to improve developer experience, which has also been merged. Then we have also had a new pull request, so 3411, which adds the components needed to pull IPFS for the availability of a file. So thank you for submitting Leo for this PR. Does anyone have any comments on the GraphNode, any experiences since last week that they would like to mention before we look at the indexer agent?
I just put a quick vote in the stage chat for people who are running GraphNode to ask if you're running 26 in prod or not. If people could answer, that would be useful. Thanks. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Jim. On the indexer service and agent, again, no new releases. However, we have a major pull request that was submitted by Ford. Thank you for submitting that. So this is about manual allocation management functions. So we're introducing allocation management functions to the indexer management client GraphQL interface and also corresponding module in the indexer CLI tool. So what that means to you as an indexer is that instead of applying rules to be interpreted by the indexer agent into allocation management actions, you will be able to send direct requests to create, close, and reallocate allocations. Also, taking the manual allocation will send a transaction to the protocol contract and will update the indexing rules, so the agent will be able to manage the allocation moving forward. Now, this PR will probably need to go into a lot more detail. It is a very big PR. It includes a lot of detail, including implementation and all of the commands available. So we'll keep it to here for now, but I'm sure in future episodes we'll go into in depth with this PR. I know that a lot of people were excited to see that manual allocation functions are coming into Indexer Agent. This is all I had for Repo Watch this week. If there aren't any more comments from everyone on the call, I would like to hand over to Protocol Watch to Juan.
Thanks, Anna. I'll let a few seconds if anyone has anything to add to the Repo Watch section. Well, I'll take the silence as a no. For Protocol Watch, we have a few things to cover, not that many. Starting from the contracts repository, we have a small pull request for the changes to Arbitrum. It adds support for Arbitrum Nitro on the CLI commands. It's still a draft, so there's nothing really aside from a few proof of concept PRs. So that's about it from the contract repository side of things. Network subgraphs, there are no new updates since last IOH. We will have a few updates next week, though, for a few bug fixes that we'll try to have the IPFS hashes for indexers ready, so you can we can announce it early next week, and also announce it here. So yeah. Going into forum governance, there was another update to the GIP 28, subsidized query settlement. It's mostly just a question from Derek, Data Nexus, regarding whether this proposal would maybe increase the way that, or rather phase out non-active indexers, and by non-active I mean indexers that are not really serving queries. JP28 is still slightly controversial, it's still being discussed. So yeah, if anyone has any other comment about it, I would strongly suggest to go to the forums, since it's the main source of truth for the discussion. Going into forum research, we have a small update in JP27. This is regarding the stale allocations changes. I think it was a small update from Brandon, mainly saying that he was still in favor of some of the more expansive updates to the altruistic allocation and stale allocation changes, mainly incentivizing closing stale allocations and stuff. Next up is a new thread, which basically questions whether it is a good idea to delete the query dispute resolutions from the on-chain memory, and why it was being done this way. I was actually discussing this with Ariel, and the main takeaway was that it was just a gas saving reason. The idea was to have it still available from the thread. I mean, was to have it still available so that it could be used on chain for something. It didn't really mention what it would be used, but there are a few, maybe a few good ideas from that. There's also a sort of an idea or proposal regarding potentially allowing variable size binary types in subgraph development suite. This does have a few issues. Mainly, variable size binary types would be, I don't know if there would be feasible to implement. Maybe we can get into that later with David. But it would supposedly allow for basically files to be stored in subgraphs, so that could be troublesome for indexers-ish, maybe, depending on the size, I don't know. But yeah, it's a cool idea also from Derek. Going into the next section, we have the pinboard. This particular topic I'm not very familiar with, but there are a few updates from Eragon. I don't know, Anna, if you want to comment on those. It says Eragon backwards incompatible changes to the database storage layout. I think this has to do with the merge.
I'll be completely honest. I'm just looking at it just really quickly. One second. Yes, so the incompatibility would probably have to do with the location change, mostly from for the libmdbx submodule. Looking at the Twitter, this is from last week's. So this is last week's release. We've already covered it, but so what it contains is a Docker Hub build. It contains a fix for integration tool, a fix for transaction pool panic, and all defaults case for ETH estimated gas RPC method. So all of this would have been big changes. So I guess rather than us talking about it, has anyone experienced since last week when we briefly covered this release? Has anyone had any other experiences with release 2022-04-01 beta? So not the one we covered today, but the one from last week on Aragon. I will take that as a no. I'll tell you what, we will bring this back next week as well. If there's any issues with it, then we'll follow up on the Aragon repo. But yeah,
Quick will actually come back. I think the incompatibility that the one was referring to is for a upcoming alpha release for the merge. That the database won't be compatible. But as far as I can tell, this alpha release is not available yet. So that's something we'll have to discuss again.
I think the Aragon database migration has to do with the problem on certain Linux kernel versions. There was some weird issue, and my understanding that has been patched, which is causing the migration of the database.
I see. Okay. Thank you for that, Cohen and Nuviba. We'll keep an eye on this. If there's anything in addition that you guys need to know, we'll update you. And with that, I will pass back to Abel for side chat.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So before we jump into the next section, I want to flip it to Jim. So Jim has something he'd like to discuss in relation to indexer ENS names. So Jim, without further ado.
Thanks, Abel. So yeah, I wanted to bring up the discussion of identity on the graph network. This was sort of spawned off a conversation I had with Tegan, who is, observing the fact that there's a lot of indexers out there that just don't have a name at all. They just have an address for their indexer operation. And, in a typical proof of stake network, one of the mandatory fields to fill in when you're, registering your validator on chain or whatever, is a name for your indexer. For your validator or your node. Here we operate in a slightly different way. You don't have to do that. In fact, I don't know that there is a field for name when you register your indexer on chain. I think we're really tied more to the sort of decentralized identity side of things. So ENS 3-box ceramic for decentralized identity. And I'm just interested to know other indexers, anyone's really his opinion on this. Do you feel like it should be a mandatory requirement for let's just say for now indexers to have an identity attached to their indexing operation? Do you think it's okay that some indexers choose not to have an identity attached to their indexer operation? So, I'd be interested to hear both an indexer's point of view on that, and then maybe also if there's delegators here that want to chat, and does that seem like a problem to you as well? Not having an identity for an indexer you might choose. And I'm going to pick on people if nobody wants to speak up.
I actually wanted to speak up, so don't pick on
Brilliant.
me. Yeah, I think I don't think it should be like obligatory to have a name, but I feel that it should be a lot more rewarded reputation-wise. We don't have a reputation system, of course, but I don't think people really care that much regarding the whether or not the indexer that they choose has a name or not. I think it should be more like all around. I think it should be more rewarded from the delegator's perspective to have a name or not than it really is. But yeah.
What about one of the things I was thinking about is, what if you had there was a sort of an agreement that dashboards don't show indexers that don't provide a name? Is that, is that encroaching on a dashboard provider's or the ability to deliver, like, what would you call, like, open data? Or do you think that's something that should be looked at as well, or at least a tick box, so that you can filter by, you know, indexers that have an ENS?
Particularly, I think that would be a little bit excessive, in my opinion. It should be better aimed at something like Emblem DAO, what Emblem DAO is doing. ENS names should be fairly rewarded in the reputation system that they are kind of like aiming to build, instead of like just obscuring them from the dashboards themselves, because I think that would, people would still be able to create dashboards that work around those limitations.
Yeah.
So it really wouldn't. I think people would choose to use dashboards that show them the full data rather than like an obscured view of the data, which makes sense totally from an open data perspective. And I think like a reputation leaderboard or something could be used as a more like approachable way to really incentivize ENS names on indexers.
So you feel like the real value can only be, or the real incentive to sort of set an identity is only really enabled by having a proper reputation system, which is something we generally don't have, but it's been worked on in the space at the moment. Is that what you're getting at, Juan? So we shouldn't really be interfering, and we should try and make the incentives steer the behavior.
Yeah, sort of like I think like any way to directly intervene, kind of like obscuring data and stuff, would not be the best way to approach it, but rather like incentivizing through other means like reputation and stuff. So yeah, pretty much spot on what you said.
I have a non-indexer view on that.
Please go ahead, Oliver.
Maybe more from a delegator's perspective. I'm in line with Juan. We have identified ENS name being part of the reputation model that we want to include in the upgrades to the UI and the Explorer, so that they would be batched, or grouped into the bottom of the list, similar to the decentralization bucket at the top. They would be collapsed at the bottom if they don't have an ENS name. To me, that's more the spirit of how to go about it. It feels to me more authentic in the spirit of Web3, being permissionless and not having this entry of barrier introduced that goes into identity, I feel. So I'm with Juan.
I agree with this approach, generally speaking. But I wonder, Jim or someone else, have you heard of one of these indexer, and you have a chance to? Do we know why they're not doing it? It's just because it's too complex, they don't see the importance, or they try to remain anonymous? Do we have some explanations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I certainly haven't canvassed anybody. I guess there are some. It's an information game, right? For some, right? There'll be some out there that just don't want people to know that they're associated with maybe another indexer, or or maybe they just don't care.
It's a different name, so it's not that they're not doing anything.
Sorry, say again. You were breaking up there.
Sorry, I was saying that they could pick a alias or use a different name if they feel like to. So that there must be some technical or some, maybe just they just don't know that how beneficial for the reputation it is to consider their own name.
It's actually a really interesting point, like creating an incentive system so people actually want to use ENS names is actually difficult if you don't really know why they are not using them in the first place. I would think like a reputation system that incentivizes this would fix most of the cases, given that it would like most likely impact in the amount of delegators they get or something. But if you don't really know, maybe if it's a technical thing, like they don't really know how to do that, you don't really need to create any more incentives. You just need to make it so that it's easier to use, I guess. So it might be for a few different reasons then.
Yeah, I guess. Go on, Anna.
I was just gonna say, if we have anyone on the call who's an indexer who is basically working anonymous Well, I guess, no, that doesn't make sense. You can't ask that question. Never mind. You go ahead, Jim.
I was just thinking about like path of least resistance and stuff, right? Like the actual effort to create, to set the NS in the first place has a number of resistance points. The first being, can you be bothered? The second being, do you want to spend the transaction fees to buy an ENS? Or even if you've already got an ENS, then to register it against your indexer or move it to your indexer. I wonder if some of those things, if you just had a simple field, let's say, that would set an on-chain name against your indexer registration details that could just be any name you like. I wonder if that's something people would just use if it was there. Again, this is all like speculation and just thinking off the top of my head, but it's like, what could you put in place that would be the least path of resistance to getting people to, try to brand their indexers, should they want to?
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure if there is really a problem that we are having right now. I don't know if you count all the expenses that you make as an indexer. I would be very surprised to find out that the cost of the ENS and the ENS association would be what stops you. So it could be a knowledge thing. So maybe it needs to be clear in the documentation if that's not already the case. I remember it when I was setting it up. It was documented, but it was also linked to the vesting contract. There could be a number of reasons of why people are not doing it. But yeah, I think when we're trying to do education, in within the graph, I think from the perspective of a delegator, knowing who your indexer is and therefore having a name associated, potentially is a useful benchmark. And as such, it might be interesting if some of the dashboards would allow to filter anything that doesn't have a name set, to filter it out. But I wouldn't go as far to completely hide it to completely hide it from interfaces, or to make it mandatory in some ways. When we would go that path, my question is, how far do you go? If I set 𝗨𝗨 as my indexer, do you know who I am? Or I mean, I do have a name set, but do you know anything more with that? So then you sort of start moving to, you need to put KYC on your indexer, and that's something I don't want to go. I don't think we should be as permissionless as possible. So I'm not sure I'm actually seeing that we have a problem in terms of nameless indexes on the network. If they are performing as they should, then they can stay on the network. If they're not performing as they should, they're probably getting slashed or not seeing any revenue. So in that sense, the protocol is taking care of things. So perhaps the only thing that is remaining is to make it easier for delegators to say, okay, if it doesn't have a name, I don't want to see it, basically. But that should be still the delegator's choice. I don't think it should be hidden. That creates the sort of two-speed network, in a sense of you can still do it anyway, even if you need to go to the contracts directly. So I don't see a benefit in that either.
I mean, I would totally agree with you on the optional or optionality. None of this should be something deemed, on high, that in the dashboard should never show, addresses without ENS names. I think an idea of like you say, a radio button or whatever that can filter just by index with the ENS is a useful one for. At the end of the day, I should have probably stated what my personal objective here would be, and I think it's Tegan who brought up the thought, would be thinking along the same lines, is what we want to do is to try and provide delegators with more options. If delegators have more options, then the natural distribution of GRT will improve. So that's the ultimate objective in my eyes, is if we can identify why these indexers don't choose to use identity tools, maybe we can figure out a way to incentivize them to do so, such that delegators have more options. More options they're confident in, I should be clear.
Yeah, I also agree a lot with what Juan and stuff was saying. Like, if you do set an ENS, that doesn't necessarily, you're going to create a Twitter to link your identity and participate in Discord or any of the other things. But I think one good view would be to possibly on the Explorer put a query and indexer fee reward cut deviation metric. I think that would help a lot with kind of giving indexer or delegators an insight into indexers that, maybe sandwich attacking or have a history of it.
Oh, right. So you mean like some kind of derivated number that shows their volatility in terms of their cuts?
Yeah, exactly. Like an average metric of how far they're deviating from the average number, let's say.
Right. That's an interesting idea.
There's some discussions on Soulbound when they do their reputation badges, where we've discussed this piece and how to possibly measure that. So they're going to come up with some ideas. On the Graftronauts page, you can already see these settings as a trending line when it comes to the effective rewards cuts. I think it's effective rewards cuts line that they show, which would come up as a spike, right?
Yeah, what you really want is a spark line against each indexer to show that's a small profile. Like you see a 7-day spark line on CoinGecko, for example, right? For prices of coins, same type of thing. You could very easily identify volatility in cuts with a small spark line like that.
Except that in our case, it should be at least 28 days, right? Because
like the time frame would need to be much bigger. Yeah. Okay, we're at 20 minutes to the hour. Abel, thank you very much for the time to discuss this. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing it up. And I do love the sentiment of the conversation and how it's like geared towards understanding the pain point and the reason why people aren't using ENS names, and then thinking about how to incentivize them to do so. I do kind of agree with a lot of the sentiment of that conversation. Fantastic. Well, I'm very excited to introduce the next section, which is a deep dive into the Graph R&D roadmap. So what we've discovered is that there's this amazing blog post that was posted. In fact, let me see if I could post it in the stage chat. Just bear with me one moment. Essentially outlining the R&D roadmap. For some reason, I can't do it. Can anyone? Yeah, perfect. Juan is always on the ball. Thank you so much, sir. Fantastic. So, this blog post has articulated the future roadmap, and I think it does a great job of breaking down the different areas that are going to be developed in the coming months and years. In the months and years to come. There we go. English is working. And so we'd love to dive deep into it and perhaps take a segment of IOH for the next 5 IOHs to dive deep. And so today's one, we are very lucky to have David Luter and Juan to bring us into data and APIs. They're going to do a great job of kind of elaborating more about this particular section of the blog post, what the R&D kind of updates will be, and kind of be there to answer any sort of questions. So Juan, I'll leave it to you to bring us into this topic.
Thanks, Abel. So as Abel mentioned, the R&D roadmap has been an amazing blog post, and we wanted to cover it. I would say not super in depth, because it would be like we could talk for hours about this. We wanted to do a small section each of the next 5 episodes, kind of like highlighting each of the working groups. To get into a little bit into more context, the R&D roadmap establishes a few working groups for the many core developers to work towards an aligned set of problems. There are 5 of them. We will be covering the first one today, which is data and APIs. This particular working group has everything to do with GraphNode related stuff, as well as subgraph, everything related to the subgraph ecosystem. There are many areas where this is important. There are a few of them are, for example, indexing performance, anything related to improving the speed at which subgraphs sync, which is always a pain point for indexers and subgraph developers alike. Also, anything related to the firehose, which is sort of like related to the indexing speed, but it's also related to possible streaming architectures and other improvements. There's also some of the stuff that is being worked on by the guild regarding GraphQL and everything related to GraphQL itself, as well as multi-blockchain optimization of subgraph developer experience and so on. So we wanted to have kind of like an expert of this working group here with us, so we can discuss a little bit further and open up the discussion to the public if they wanted to ask anything in particular. So here's David Lutter. He's one of the main developers, one of the most experienced people in anything related to the graph stack and particular GraphNode. So yeah, thank you for joining us, Lutter.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Just want to point out that we also have Adam on, who's the product manager for GraphNode. So yeah, if you have questions afterwards, you can either reach out to me or him if there's anything you want more detail on or something like that. And yeah, on indexing performance, the first thing I want to do before I talk about roadmap, I wanted to highlight some of the things that have happened in terms of indexing performance, because it's sort of an ongoing concern. Yeah, there's a lot of things that subgraph developers that can do today to make sure that their subgraphs don't have bad performance or terrible performance. The first one is that something I see a lot in the hosted service is that people build large arrays in their subgraphs. That's always a bad thing. Like, arrays should always be derived, where you store the array entry in some other entity. The docs actually have details on how to do that. The reason large arrays are bad is because whenever you update an entity in your mapping, we actually we keep the old version and we store a new version. And so as if you have an array with like 1,000 entries, then you add one more, in the database, we will have, the old version of the array with 1,000 entries and then a new version with 1,001 entries. And, that adds up really quickly and leads to sort of a lot of write load on the database. The other one, which I think is always something should be on everybody's mind, is avoiding contract calls. Contract calls are just slow because during indexing we need to reach out to the Ethereum client, and that interaction just takes a while. And so if there's anything you can do in your subgraph to avoid contract calls, that's always the way to go. The next two things, yeah, go ahead.
No, totally. I was just meaning to say that. I also seen a few things in a new post by you regarding a few new.
Yeah, I was going to talk.
Yeah, about that. Go for it then.
Yeah, and so two pretty new additions that appeared with 0.26 are that you can now use bytes for the ID of an entity. So basically, it gets stored as binary data. That has two big advantages. One is that if you have a hexadecimal string and store it as a string, you need 1 byte for each character in that hexadecimal string. Whereas if you store it as sort of binary string, you only need half as much storage. And basically having less storage always means faster store interactions. So that's the one thing. Use bytes for the ID fields wherever you can. You should only use string or the old ID type if you really need to store human readable text. but bytes is, you should default to it. The other one is this idea of immutable entities. If you look at what subgraphs do, there's roughly three things they do with their data, or where entities come from. One is it's just data that's extracted from the chain verbatim, right? Like your handler gets an event, and you just turn it into an entity and store it in the database. Then there's sort of bucketed aggregations that people do, right? You build some hourly, daily, whatever, averages, sums, max aggregations. And then the third is sort of lifetime aggregations, right? Where you keep track of, I don't know, trade volume over all time for a token. And for the first kind, where you're just extracting data, it's much better to mark these entities as immutable. So basically any entity that, your mappings just write once and then don't ever modify after that block in which they were written, you should mark as immutable, because that lets us use much cheaper indexes in the database, because we basically don't have to be prepared for, oh, this entity can have multiple versions, right? An immutable entity can only ever have one version, and we can optimize storage for that. And those things, the bytes ID and immutable entities, I actually wrote a little more on our engineering blog with like some instructions for how you can take an existing subgraph and use those things in an existing subgraph.
Totally.
Two more things we've done. One that's been out for a little longer and is in 0.26 is pipelining the whole mapping execution. It used to be that when we execute mappings, we first need to find blocks that are interesting to your subgraph. Then there's some back and forth with the Ethereum client to figure out what triggers exactly in that block we should send to your subgraph. Then we run the mappings itself, basically run assembly script code. And when that's all done, we tell the database, here's a bunch of stuff to write. And so what's in 0.26 is that we pipelined getting blocks and data from the chain, from the RPC endpoint, with the rest of execution. So with running mappings and writing stuff to the store. That helps, of course, a lot, because now we can already talk to Ethereum client about blocks. We can talk to them about block 10 while the mappings are still executing block 5. Right, and so we don't need to, mapping execution doesn't need to wait for us to talk to the RPC client. The other thing that we just merged is also pipelining the store writes, so that the mappings can work on block 10 while the store's still writing block 8 or something like that. There's a setting where you can say how many blocks behind the writer can be, but the pipelining store writes in sort of the testing I did, the performance testing I did, has a pretty big impact on indexing speed. In theory, it could speed up your subgraph by a factor of 2. You're not going to get that speed up out of it, but 50% faster or something like that is definitely something you can get with pipeline store writes.
That does sound amazing.
In the hosted service over the next, week or so, and it's going to appear in the next release.
Incredible. Yeah, I've been experiencing slow syncing times for especially analytic related subgraphs. So always having like a few percentage improvements is worth it. And this looks like a huge improvement. So it would probably impact every one of you relatively soon. Yeah.
And I mean, that's still one of the things, we'll work more on, is, writing mutable entities is just, pretty slow because of some details in Postgres and how it builds the indexes. We also have an external company working on trying to speed up those things in Postgres, but I have no idea how long that will take to actually appear somewhere.
Yeah, okay, there's also a few other things in the indexing performance side of things, like declarative aggregations, streaming architecture, and optimized proof of indexing. But we also have Firehose related stuff that would certainly impact indexing performance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Firehose, how much it impacts performance depends a lot on what the subgraph is. We're actually doing testing right now on sort of performance and also correctness, of course, of Firehose. And the plan is that relatively soon we'll start using Firehose in the hosted service, just to get also some experience in like how to scale the thing out, how many subgraphs can you throw at a Firehose with a given number of CPUs, memory, and so on. But that's one of the things in the roadmap that's coming really, really soon. That we'll have a Firehose running in the hosted service, at least for mainnet. For other networks, it's a little farther out because streaming fast needs to do a little more work on enabling some of the other chains, especially the EVM compatible chains, to work with Firehose. But I would say that part of doing indexing with Firehoses is sort of fairly soon that we'll see that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think we have a few more topics to cover in the data and APIs working group, but since indexers are oftentimes super interested in everything related to their stack, which is the indexing performance and Firehose related mostly, I would like to open it up to any questions from the audience, since we are probably going to run a little bit short on time for this one. Does anyone have any questions related to indexing performance or maybe Firehose integrations? I don't know if you, David, are the best persons to ask about Firehose. That would be something more akin to anyone from Streaming Fast, but I think we can open up those discussions.
Yes, and if anyone in the audience has a question relating to this, please do raise your hand and we can get you on stage.
I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, please.
David, thanks for joining and talking about this today. I guess two questions. The first one, like I'm just looking at the blog and I see you talked about quite a few different improvements there. There's 4, however, in the roadmap. So my first question would be, you have this sort of typical idea where most of your improvement usually comes from a few areas of improvement. Are there specific areas here which are going to give us the most improvement in indexing performance? And then the second question, which is related, would be, you talked a lot up there about changing the way that developers use the subgraphs in order to, promote higher performance. What sort of challenge is that in terms of education? Is it very, is it a real struggle to get people to move to more efficient ways of get out of their lazy ways when it comes to development? So
and I don't think it's lazy ways. It's that some of those things aren't really obvious that they're bad for performance. Right, a subgraph, right? Like building large arrays is not something that you immediately think of as something that might be slow unless you're really deep in how the data is stored. And I think that the struggle there is, as you said, is mostly around documentation and sort of spreading the knowledge. I'm not sure what the best way would be to sort of socialize some of these tips and ideas farther. So if anybody has ideas, knows what a good forum for that is, I'd be really, really interested in hearing about that. In terms of your first question around what will give us the biggest speed up in indexing, it's the two things, unfortunately, that are also the farthest out in terms of implementation. That's the parallel execution and streaming architecture. Because they're sort of interrelated, and both of them will require that how you write a subgraph changes pretty drastically. Like for parallel, to enable parallel execution, right? What you want to do is you want to say, mainnet has 15 million blocks. So to index a subgraph, start 15 jobs that each handle a million blocks, but then you need to know how to piece the data from each of those 15 jobs back together. And the way subgraphs are written today, we just don't have that knowledge, right? Because the code in subgraphs typically does a lot of things in the same handler. Like you extract some data, you update some statistics, and they all need slightly different treatment for parallel execution. So similar for a streaming architecture. You also need to have a little more knowledge about what the handlers, the subgraph is doing with its data, so you can build a pipeline of steps rather than just have sort of handlers that do everything in one shot. So that's there's a lot of research and work going on in that area, but it's going to take a while for that to hit a graph node release, or it'll require more than just a graph node release to just hit the ecosystem.
Got it.
The optimized proof of indexing is something that's fairly simple. It depends on like subgraphs that write a lot of entities on each block. We've seen that calculating the proof of indexing can take a pretty significant amount of time, like 10% of the indexing time. And we have a better implementation. It'll require an API version bump. But I'd say integrating that is more a matter of weeks, and it's probably going to be in the next release. Declarative aggregations are sort of they're also declarative aggregations give you two things. One, it makes it a little easier for subgraph writers to build these aggregations, like hourly, daily aggregate with less code. And the other one is because GraphNode now understands what these things are better, we can again avoid some of the really expensive indexes that we have to build if all we know is this is some entity and it might be changed at any point in time. Okay, did that answer your questions, Jim?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for the insight, David.
We are close to the top of the hour. We have still a few things to cover from the Data and APIs working group. I think we might be able to continue the conversation on Graph Client, new data sources, and subgraph developer experience on the next episode. We will be happy to host that too. I think, Adam, you would be probably the best guest to have for that sort of topics, right?
Yeah, happy to talk about those things. And I think Dotan from the Guild was also got a lot of great insight, particularly on the client side.
Sounds great. Yeah. So do we have any other questions for David?
Yeah, and I'll make sure to join next week too. So there are more questions.
Yeah, I think people will still be interested in discussing things related to the indexer stack and indexing performance. So yeah, that will be greatly appreciated, David. So I'll get back to you, Abel, for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So yeah, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is the 57th episode. Thank you all for coming. We really do appreciate your attendance. And as a token of our appreciation for your attendance, here is the secret word for the POAP. It is verifiable hours. That is verifiable hours. VERIFIABLEHOURS. So if you download the POAP app and type in verifiable hours into the secret word section, you should be able to redeem your POAP. You have about 10 minutes to do so before we close the admissions for the POAPs. There you have it. Thank you so much, everyone. Really do appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks all.